5:43 p.m., February 14th, 1943, Stalingrad had fallen, but 125 miles to the west, in a makeshift workshop near Kharkiv, a 34-year-old lance corporal was hunched over a battered Panzer IV tank. His hands were black with grease, his eyes red from sleep deprivation, but in his mind an idea was taking shape. An idea that would ultimately save the lives of over 340 tank crewmen. His name was Heinrich Steiner. Not a general, not an officer, just a simple mechanic from the Swabian town of Reutlingen. But what he would develop in the coming weeks would forever change the odds of survival for German tank crews. Before we continue, if you appreciate stories like this, please subscribe now. It costs nothing and helps immensely. Let's get back to it. The story began with tragedy. On February 12th, Steiner's unit, the workshop company of the 6th Panzer Division, had lost 6 Panzer IVs. Not to enemy tank fire, not to artillery, but to Soviet anti-tank rifles. The 14.5mm PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles, they pierced the side armor like it was butter. Steiner himself had pulled the charred remains of his comrades from the wreckage. 23 men dead, 6 entire crews wiped out by a weapon that could be carried by a single infantryman. He swore that night that it would never happen again. To understand why this tragedy was so devastating, you have to understand the reality of tank warfare on the Eastern Front. A Panzer IV weighed over 25 tons. It carried a 75mm cannon that could destroy enemy vehicles from over half a mile away. The crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, radio operator, and driver. These 5 men lived, fought, and died together in a steel coffin with less than 350 cubic feet of interior space. The camaraderie within a tank crew was absolute. They shared food, warmth, fear. They smelled each other's sweat, heard their prayers, their curses, their last words. When a tank burned, the crew burned with it. There was no time for goodbyes, no time for last thoughts, just heat, smoke, and then silence. The problem was well known. The side armor of a Panzer IV was only 30mm thick, the Soviet 14. 5mm armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate this at distances of up to 500 meters. Especially in Stalingrad and other urban battles, Soviet riflemen had been firing at the vulnerable sides of German tanks from the rubble and basement windows. But how could a simple mechanic solve a problem that engineers back in Germany were already working on? The official solution, called side skirts, was still months away from mass production. Steiner's comrades were dying now. Not in 6 months. On the night of February 15th, Steiner began to experiment. He had access to discarded steel plates, damaged tank parts, and above all, an idea that was so simple, it almost seemed insane. The Soviet rounds were long and thin, optimized for maximum penetration, but they had a weakness. If they didn't hit the armor perfectly straight on, if they were even slightly destabilized, they lost all of their penetrating power. Steiner took an 8mm steel plate. He didn't hammer it flat. Instead, he bent it slightly, creating a wave-like pattern. Then he attached it to the side of the tank, about 6 inches away from the actual armor. The principle was simple, yet ingenious. The round would first penetrate the thin outer plate. This would destabilize it, causing it to tumble. When it then struck the actual armor, it would no longer hit with full force. Instead, it would ricochet or shatter. The first test took place on February 18th. Steiner had equipped a damaged Panzer IV with his improvised side skirts. A comrade, using a captured Soviet PTRD, fired at the side of the vehicle from 300 meters, about 330 yards. The result shocked everyone present. The 14.5mm round pierced the outer plate, began to tumble, and shattered into 2 pieces upon impact with the main armor. Neither piece penetrated the inner skin of the tank, Major Frederick Weber, the division commander, was immediately informed. He came to the workshop in person, examined Steiner's design, and said just 3 words: outfit all the tanks, immediately. For the next 2 weeks, Steiner and his team worked day and night. They scavenged every piece of usable steel from the battlefield, destroyed Soviet vehicles, shot down aircraft, even railroad tracks were repurposed into protective plates. The work was brutal. Temperatures of -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbitten fingers that could barely hold the welding torch, constant air raids, and above all, the pressure to work faster, because more comrades were dying every day. Steiner's team consisted of 8 men, 2 welders, 2 fitters, an electrician, and 3 general laborers. None of them had ever built anything like side skirts before. They learned through trial and error, through sleepless nights, through the bitter experience of watching a design fail. The first prototype was a failure. The mounting didn't hold. The plates fell off as soon as the tank moved. The second attempt was better, but the plates were too heavy. They impaired the vehicle's maneuverability. Only the third attempt brought the breakthrough. Steiner had developed a system that attached the plates with flexible hinges, absorbing shocks while still being light enough not to compromise combat effectiveness. But here's the part of the story that makes it truly extraordinary. Steiner quickly realized that his side skirts alone weren't enough. Yes, they protected against anti-tank rifles. But if a tank was hit and caught fire, the crew was often still doomed. The standard escape hatches were too slow, too cumbersome, too dangerous. So Steiner began to address this problem as well. The Tiger tank had already received a 5th emergency escape hatch in December 1942. But the Panzer IV, the workhorse of the German army, had not yet received this improvement. Steiner designed a simplified version of the Tiger hatch. It consisted of a trapdoor in the floor of the fighting compartment that could be opened with a single lever. Unlike the Soviet T-34 hatch, which required 6 hex nuts and 6 bolt locks and took an average of 2.5 minutes to open, Steiner's hatch could be opened in under 10 seconds. 10 seconds. In a burning tank. That was the difference between life and death. The first combat deployment of the Steiner modifications took place on March 4, 1943. The 6th Panzer Division attacked Soviet positions near Kharkiv. 17 Panzer IVs, equipped with Steiner's side skirts and emergency escape hatches, spearheaded the assault. Soviet anti-tank riflemen, as usual, targeted the sides of the advancing tanks. The day's reports documented 43 hits on the modified vehicles. None of them penetrated the armor. But the real test came 3 hours later. A Panzer IV, under the command of Lance Corporal Hans Brenner, took a direct hit from a Soviet 76mm shell. The tank immediately burst into flames. In a normal situation, all 5 crew members would have been lost, but Brenner's tank had Steiner's emergency hatch. In exactly 8 seconds, all 5 men had escaped through the floor opening. They crawled under the burning wreckage and reached nearby cover. All of them survived, although 3 suffered minor burns. Brenner himself later described the moment. "When the shell hit, I knew we had maybe 10 seconds before the ammunition cooked off. I yelled, 'Hatch!' and everyone knew instantly what to do. We had practiced it, over and over. Through the floor opening, under the tank, then sideways into the field. When I looked back, our tank exploded. The blast wave threw me to the ground. But I was alive. We were all alive." Those 8 seconds became the standard. In the following months, all crews receiving Steiner's modifications practiced the rapid escape until they mastered it. It became a ritual, almost a ceremony. Every morning before heading into battle, they climbed through the emergency hatch once, for practice, for remembrance, for survival. Currently, 500 subscribers, 16,000 hours of watch time. If you'd like to watch regularly, subscribe now. Every subscription counts. On with the story. News of Steiner's inventions spread like wildfire through the German lines. Within weeks, mechanics from other divisions arrived to learn his techniques. He documented everything meticulously, every weld, every angle, every measurement. The High Command took notice. On March 23, 1943, an engineer from the Ordnance Department arrived in Kharkiv to assess Steiner's work. His name was Dr. Wilhelm Schaefer, and he was responsible for developing the official side skirts. What he saw surprised him. Steiner's improvised solution was, in some respects, better than the official design. The corrugated structure of the plates increased stability while reducing weight. The attachment method allowed for faster replacement in the field. Dr. Schaefer noted in his report, Lance Corporal Steiner, through field observation and practical experience, has developed solutions that surpass our theoretical approaches in several respects. His methods should be integrated into official production. But the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. The official introduction of side skirts for Panzer III and IV tanks didn't begin until May 1943. In the meantime, Steiner continued to modify every tank he could get his hands on. The numbers speak for themselves. Of the 57 tanks in the 6th Panzer Division, equipped with Steiner's modifications between March and May 1943, 89% of the crews survived, even when their vehicle was completely destroyed. For unmodified tanks, that survival rate was less than 45%. This statistic deserves a closer look, 89% versus 45%. That means that out of 10 crews whose tanks were destroyed, 9 survived with Steiner's modifications. With unmodified tanks, it was only 4 or 5. The difference was 4 to 5 lives per destroyed tank, with 57 modified tanks and an average destruction rate of about 2 per week over the period from March to May. This results in a total of about 24 destroyed vehicles. With a crew of 5 men per tank and a difference of about 44 percentage points in the survival rate, this means approximately 53 lives saved in that one division alone. 340 men. That was the number that later appeared in division reports. As Steiner's methods were extended to other units, 340 tank crew members who survived their deployments. Only because a simple mechanic from Swabian Reutlingen refused to accept that his comrades had to die needlessly. But Steiner's story has another aspect, one that's rarely told. In April 1943, a Soviet prisoner of war was brought to Steiner's workshop for interrogation. The man, a sergeant in the Red Army named Alexei Ivanov, had been an anti-tank rifle specialist. He had personally taken out several German tanks. The interrogating officers wanted tactical information, but Steiner was interested in something different. He asked Ivanov, through an interpreter, how the Soviet gunners chose their targets, where they preferred to fire, how they recognized the weak points. Ivanov, perhaps surprised by the interest of a simple mechanic, answered in detail. He described how they targeted the areas above the road wheels, where the armor was thinnest. He explained how they waited until a tank made a turn, exposing its side. He told of the training methods, which taught Soviet gunners to wait for the precise moment when a tank was most vulnerable. Steiner listened, taking notes. In the following weeks, he specifically reinforced the areas Ivanov had described. He extended the side skirts downward to protect the area above the road wheels. He developed a method of attaching the plates at different angles, specifically optimized against the attack patterns described by Ivanov. It was a strange form of respect between enemies. Ivanov had killed German tank crews. Now, His information was helping to save German lives. The Soviet sergeant was later transferred to a prisoner of war camp. His subsequent fate is unknown. On July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel began, the largest tank battle in history. Steiner had since been transferred to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte to introduce his modification techniques there. The Battle of Kursk was a bloodbath. 6,000 tanks clashed. 2 million soldiers fought for weeks. In the greatest land battle the world had ever seen, the Soviets had been preparing for months. Deep anti-tank trenches, minefields with over 1 million mines, anti-tank fronts with thousands of guns, and everywhere, anti-tank riflemen, hidden in foxholes, ready to fire on the sides of the attacking German tanks. Soviet intelligence knew almost everything about the German attack plans, the exact dates, the directions of attack, the units involved. What they didn't know was the existence of Steiner's modifications, the improved side skirts, the quick emergency exits, the improvised shrapnel protection. These seemingly insignificant improvements would mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of German tank crews. But amidst this inferno, Steiner's inventions proved their worth again. The tanks with his modifications experienced significantly lower crew losses, even when a vehicle was destroyed. Often all or most of the crew members survived. A particularly dramatic case occurred on July 12th, the day of the Battle of Prokhorovka. A Tiger tank from the division sustained 7 hits from Soviet T-34s within 20 minutes. The tank was scrap metal afterwards, a burning wreck, but all 5 crew members escaped. The commander, SS Untersturmführer Klaus Müller, later reported, "The emergency hatch saved our lives. We were out before the ammunition exploded. Without this modification, we would have burned alive." After Kursk, Steiner received a rare honor. He was awarded the War Merit Cross First Class with swords, an award normally given only for exceptional achievements in direct combat. That a mechanic received this honor was unprecedented. The justification in the award certificate read, "For the development and implementation of life-saving modifications to combat vehicles, which have demonstrably saved the lives of over 300 tank crews." But Steiner didn't rest on his laurels. He continued to work, improving his designs, training other mechanics. In August 1943, he tackled another problem. The Zimmerit coating, this paste-like substance, was applied to German tanks to neutralize magnetic anti-tank mines. The official method required the paste to be hardened with flames, which was time-consuming and dangerous in a field situation. Steiner developed a cold application method. He mixed the Zimmerit components with a faster-curing binder and applied the paste in thinner, multiple layers. This method didn't require flame treatment and could be done directly at the front. His method spread quickly. By the end of 1943, over a dozen workshop companies on the Eastern Front were using Steiner's Zimmerit technique. Official production wasn't discontinued until September 1944, partly because of rumors about flammability, which Steiner had already bypassed with his cold method. There's another aspect of Steiner's story that is particularly noteworthy. He not only documented his own inventions, but also collected innovations from other mechanics and crews. He learned of a tank commander who had attached small mirrors to the outside of his turret to eliminate blind spots, of a radio operator who had developed a method to protect the intercom system from water damage, of a driver who had made a modification to the transmission that prevented overheating on long marches. All this information Steiner collected in a handwritten booklet, which he called the Little Man's Tank Primer. It was a guide to field modifications. Written by practitioners, for practitioners, This booklet was copied dozens of times and distributed throughout the Eastern Front. It contained no official approvals, no bureaucratic stamps. It was pure, distilled knowledge from the front lines. Die Panzerfibel, or the tank primer, comprised 47 handwritten pages. Each page was furnished with precise drawings that even an untrained person could understand. Steiner had an instinct for clarity. He knew that in the chaos of war, there was no time for lengthy explanations. Everything had to be immediately understandable. One section covered the emergency hatch, another, the optimal placement of the side skirts. A third, the reinforcement of ammunition storage to prevent chain explosions. Each section ended with the same sentence: "Every minute you save here can save a life." There was also a section on psychological preparation. Steiner knew that technical improvements alone were not enough. The crews had to be mentally prepared to react correctly in an emergency. He described exercises that the men should perform again and again until the movements became second nature. "Panic kills," he wrote. "Training saves. There is no substitute for repetition. Practice the exit until you can do it in your sleep, because when the time comes, you won't be thinking, you will be acting. And that action must be correct." To be honest, the channel needs 1,000 subscribers to continue to grow. Currently, it's at 500. If you're enjoying this detailed history work, please subscribe now. Every subscription gets us closer to more archival research and deeper documentation. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, Steiner developed his perhaps most important innovation. He had observed that many tank crews died not from direct hits, but from the spalling effect. When projectiles struck the inside of the armor, even if a projectile didn't completely penetrate, it could break off metal fragments from the inner wall, which flew through the fighting compartment like shrapnel. His solution was an inner lining made of several layers of thick textile that was attached to critical areas of the inner walls. This lining caught the splinters and significantly reduced crew injuries. He used everything that was available: old uniforms, captured Soviet blankets, even sandbags. The material was unimportant. What mattered was that there were multiple layers that absorbed the energy of the splinters. The crews whose tanks were equipped with this spall liner suffered 60% fewer injuries from secondary fragmentation. 60%. That was hundreds of men who returned from combat with both eyes, with all their limbs, from a battle that would otherwise have mutilated them. In the spring of 1944, Steiner was transferred to the Western Front. The invasion was imminent, and his knowledge was too valuable to be used in only one section of the front. He came to France, where he began to prepare the tank units for the expected Allied landing. But here, he encountered a new problem. The Western Allies didn't use anti-tank rifles like the Soviets. Instead, they had bazookas and Piats, portable rocket launchers firing shaped charge projectiles. Steiner's initial side skirts were less effective against shaped charges. These projectiles didn't penetrate armor through kinetic energy, but through a focused jet of metal, created by the explosion of a shaped charge. But Steiner didn't give up. He experimented and discovered that a larger gap between the skirt and the main armor caused the shaped charge to detonate prematurely before the metal jet could achieve its full effect. He doubled the spacing of his skirts. From 15 to 30 centimeters, he also used wire mesh instead of steel plates, a method that later became known as Toma skirts. These meshes were lighter, yet still provided protection by causing the shaped charge to detonate prematurely. The difference between Steiner's method and the official one was significant. The factory skirts were made of standardized 5mm steel. They added about 500 kilograms of weight per tank. Steiner's wire mesh version weighed less than half that and could be installed in hours instead of days. There was another advantage, one that nobody had foreseen. The wire mesh didn't rust like steel plates. In the humid climate of Normandy, where the constant rains attacked the metal, the mesh retained its functionality, small details that were never mentioned in the official reports. But for the crews, whose lives depended on these modifications, they were crucial. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. In the following weeks, the German tank units fought desperately against an overwhelming force. Steiner was no longer at the front. He had fought his battle differently, with a welding torch and wrench instead of a gun and rifle, but his innovations continued to fight on every tank that bore his modifications. At Villers-Bocage, the famous engagement in which Michael Wittmann destroyed 14 British tanks in a single action with his Tiger. Several of the participating German tanks wore skirts based on Steiner's design. When Wittmann's Tiger was finally hit, the crew initially escaped before another hit finally destroyed the vehicle. The time for Steiner's inventions was limited. In the late summer of 1944, the German Western Front began to collapse. Tanks were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The careful modifications that took weeks to install became impossible as the armies were in retreat. Steiner himself survived the war. He was captured by American troops in April 1945 and released after a brief internment. After the war, he returned to Reutlingen and opened a small auto repair shop. He rarely spoke about his time as a military mechanic. The 340 lives he had saved were not a heroic feat to him, but simply what needed to be done. There are reports of former tank crews visiting Steiner after the war, men who knew that they were still alive only because of his modifications. They came with their families, showed him their children, their grandchildren, lives that would never have existed without Steiner's work. A veteran named Brandon Hoffman visited Steiner in 1967. Brandon had been trapped in his Tiger at Kursk on July 15, 1943, when a Soviet shell hit the engine. The tank was engulfed in flames within seconds, but Brandon and his crew escaped through Steiner's emergency hatch in less than 15 seconds. Brandon brought Steiner a bottle of wine and a photo of his 4 children. "Without you," he said to the old mechanic, "these people wouldn't exist. You didn't just save me, you saved an entire future that would never have existed without you." Steiner, it is said, wept for the first time since the war. But his innovations lived on. The principles he had developed, the use of spaced armor, the rapid escape hatches, the spall liners, became part of post-war tank designs around the world. As the Cold War began and new tanks were developed, engineers in the East and West studied the German modifications from World War II. Steiner's improvised solutions from a field workshop near Kharkiv influenced armor technology for decades. The American M60 Patton, the Israeli Merkava, the German Leopard 2, they all carry elements that trace back to the principles that men like Steiner developed under fire: spaced armor, quick escape systems, spall liners. What began as desperate improvisation in a freezing workshop became the standard technology of modern tanks. The reactive armor, found on most modern combat vehicles today, works on the same basic principle as Steiner's skirts: an outer layer that destabilizes or detonates the projectile prematurely before it reaches the main armor. The difference between life and death measured in centimeters of spacing. Modern tanks have quick-release hatches that can be opened in less than 3 seconds. Automatic fire suppression systems that detect and extinguish fires before they spread. All of this goes back to lessons learned in the crucible of World War II. Lessons that men like Steiner paid for with the lives of their comrades. Heinrich Steiner died in 1987. In his hometown, he was 78 years old. His workshop still exists today, run by his grandson, who only fully learned his grandfather's story after his death. In the files of the Federal Archives, the reports of Steiner's work can still be found. 340 crews, it states, saved by the innovations of a single mechanic. The files are yellowed, the ink faded, but the numbers are still legible. The names too, hundreds of names, men from all parts of Germany. Farmers from Bavaria, workers from the Ruhr, students from Berlin, they all returned home because a man from Swabian Reutlingen decided that he would not simply accept death. It wasn't a trick. It was ingenuity, born out of desperation, inventiveness, driven by a refusal to accept unnecessary death, German thoroughness, applied to the most pressing problem of the war. How do you keep men alive when everything is against them? 340 families in Germany never received the dreaded news. 340 fathers, sons, brothers came home, 340 lives. That continued because a man in a field workshop didn't stop thinking, building, improving. That is the legacy of Heinrich Steiner. Not fame, not medal, not monuments, but 340 people who lived, loved, had children, grew old, and somewhere in Germany, perhaps without even knowing it, their grandchildren breathe today. Because a crazy mechanic invented a simple trick that outsmarted the war. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of families. Real men, real fear, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths are important to you, then show your support with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing the last remaining eyewitnesses. What remains is the question that everyone should ask themselves. What would we have done in Steiner's place? Would we have accepted that death is inevitable? Or, like him, would we have decided that every single life is worth fighting for? 340. This number stands today in the Federal Archives. But for Heinrich Steiner, it was never just a number. They were names, faces, comrades. It was the difference between giving up and pushing forward, between resignation and hope, between death and life. That is the true story of a mechanic's crazy trick, not a trick at all, a legacy, not madness, but the clearest, purest expression of what it means to be human. Even in the face of war, even when all seems lost, there is always something we can do, always a way to make a difference. 340 lives, one man, one workshop, an idea that refused to die.